At home, I have a t-shirt that was given to me as a gift. And it says Dad in big letters, but there's a dot after each one of the letters, and underneath in small letters it says dedicated and devoted. And on the bottom is a quote from Joshua. And it says, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So Joshua, in this reading this morning, he's taken over leadership of the people. Moses had led the people, brought them out of Egypt, the plagues, all that kind of stuff that we know about, and brought them through the desert and finally brought them right to the gates of the promised land. God said, you disobeyed me, and so you can't enter. And he put Joshua in charge. Joshua, during the telling of the law, because these folks were the descendants of the people who were at Mount Sinai. And then they conquer the land, and at the end of the book of Joshua, there's a retelling of the law, and there's a recovenant service. A lot of Bible scholars think when Jacob, or Israel, left and went down to Egypt to be with his son Joseph, there were probably some relatives who were left there. And so when they came back into the land, those people were able to be made a party to the covenant through this ceremony at the end. And Joshua basically finishes up his speech, if you will, by saying, this is each of your choices. And I don't know what choice your houses are going to make. But as for me and my house, we will follow the Lord. That's where that comes from. Joshua must have had a really, really tough row to hoe, especially right off the bat. Because the people, remember how the people would always grumble and complain about Moses? We talked about this over the last couple of weeks. Moses was the guy that says, okay, the Nile's going to turn into blood, and the Nile turned into blood. Noah is the guy that says, all of the firstborn will die unless you put the lamb's blood on your doorpost, and what happened? All the firstborn died. Moses was the one who was at the sea, and Pharaoh's army's coming, and a pillar of fire stops up, blocks them. Moses says, watch the power of God. And he lifts up his staff and holds it there overnight, and all of a sudden the sea is opened up and there's a path. Moses gets to the other end and puts the staff down, and the water comes in and kills the biggest army on the planet. Moses furnished water in the wilderness. Moses furnished bread in the wilderness. Moses went up on a mountain and talked face to face to God. How did they treat Moses? You're trying to kill us. We're going to stone you and go back to Egypt. Now, imagine yourself, if that's how Moses got treated, imagine yourself being the one who takes over for Moses. I think the phrase big shoes to fill would apply here, just a little bit. Joshua comes out, and he was Moses' assistant, so he was kind of the logical successor. You would have expected when Moses passed from the scene, Joshua would be the guy. But what ends up happening is they get ready to cross the Jordan, and God says to Joshua, I am today going to make you have the same status that Moses did in the eyes of the people. I'm going to begin that now. And the first thing was this crossing of the Jordan River. He told them what to say, and he went to the people. And he said, okay, the priests are going to pick up the Ark of the Covenant. And they are going to go to the Jordan River. And they are going to put their feet into the Jordan and step into it. And when they do this, the river will stop flowing and the water will pile up in a heap upstream. And it will be dry. And then the people will be able to cross over. Now, what would your reaction be if somebody told you that was what was going to happen? Okay, yeah, right. All right, fine. Prove it to me, because I don't think this can happen. And it happened. So what's your opinion of Joshua going to be at this point? Moses did this kind of stuff. You know what? Maybe he's the same kind of leader Moses was. Because they forget the bad, remember the good. Remember when you look back 20 years ago? The good old days. It wasn't really all that good. And throughout the book of Joshua, we'll be reading that over the next couple of weeks until we get to Advent. There are a number of incidences where God says something to Moses or to Joshua. Tell the people this is what I'm going to do. And Joshua goes and tells the people, and then that happens. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, and the wolves came tumbling down. That was one of those. That was one of those things that happened. That was one of my favorites because there was no way to describe, that they did something. They walked around the city and yelled and blew the trumpets in the wall. I mean, it's like, wow, It's definitely, God did this. And Joshua was the guy who said, this is what God is going to do. Now, if you look at Moses, and you read the stories about Moses, and you read the stories about Joshua, what you find out is that, yes, they talked to God, and yes, they said God was going to do this thing, and God did this thing. But if you look at it, they lived out the law that they were attempting to teach to the people. How honored is Moses? Go into the House of Representatives chamber on Capitol Hill, take the tour, and if you look directly opposite the speaker's chair, right up on the wall, there's faces all the way around. There's one face that's looking straight out that is not profile. All the others are looking to the sides. That one face is the original lawgiver. Guess who? Yeah. It's the only face in that chamber that's not looking to the side. The rest are different people in the law. And the law is enshrined in these things. But Moses is that guy because he was central. And he was the first guy who gave the law. And he was revered because he did practice what he preached. Now the scribes and Pharisees, we've been talking about that in the last couple of weeks. They were a group of people who had the positions of being God's people on earth, shepherding God's people, teaching them about what God's love is about, teaching them what God expects of them, helping them to grow and live into God. This is the position they were in. What they said when they taught from the scriptures, they taught the right things. Jesus says it himself, listen to what they say. They told people what they're supposed to be doing correctly. But at the same time, they used their positions to make themselves important. Phylacteries, you know what a phylactery is? If you've ever seen usually a conservative Jew, if you've ever been into one of their houses, you'll notice on the doorpost there's a little box. If you've ever seen that, if you've been to an Orthodox Jewish business or house, and when they walk through the door, they will touch that. In that little box is a scripture. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. First and most important commandment, as Jesus said, right? That's what's in there, because it is inherent to who they are as people. Well, a phylactery is a little box that you bind either to your wrist or to your forehead, carrying those same scripture verses. And it was something that you were supposed to do as an observant Jew. You could put it on your wrist and make it relatively small, and it's not obtrusive and you're not showing off. But you're tight with God by doing this. Well, the scribes and Pharisees would make their phylacteries big. So instead of having a little one maybe on the wrist, they had a huge one on their forehead. You know why? He's got a big phylactery. Look how religious he is. He's such a great guy. That's why they did it. And the tassels, again, if you've seen observant Jews, you'll notice strings hanging out from down underneath their clothes. It's because they're wearing a prayer shawl underneath. And those tassels have knots in them. And there are 10 knots to remind you of the 10 Commandments. It's a prayer tool. And you use that for prayer. And observant Jews would wear those tassels. And again, you know how Catholics use the rosary? Same kind of idea. To help remind you of what you're supposed to be saying in prayer. But again, the scribes and Pharisees would make them really long. They didn't have to be long. They had to be long enough to have those knots on there to help you remember what you're supposed to be about with God. This is something God gave to the people to help them do that. But they would make them really, really long. Wow, look at him. He's got long tassels. What a pious guy. He's so wonderful. That was what they did. Now, you come forward to our present day. And I tend to look to television preachers because they're the most obvious and most known. But you look to somebody like Jim and Tammy Faye Baker. And I think they probably started out with good hearts. I really do. I think they started out with good hearts, but when they decided to take their ministry onto TV, they started to get caught up in the adoration and the hero worship that kind of happens to people who are public figures. And they ended up going off the wrong path. And what ended up happening was they started doing things to make themselves look good. It wasn't about God at the center. Yeah, it was about God, but it was about me more than God. If it's about me more than God, is it really about God? And they wandered off farther and farther and farther. And yet Swaggart, who fell into the same track, and a whole bunch of television preachers. The one who I always find very interesting when this subject comes up is Billy Graham and how he handled his fame. What he did, he understood what Jesus was talking about when he talked about the lure of money and how money was so important. I mean, Jesus talked about it more than anything else. More than the kingdom of God, more than prayer, more than anything. Why? Is it good or bad? No, it's a tool. You know, a hammer's a tool. I can use it to build a hospital for folks suffering with Ebola. Or I can use it to build a concentration camp to wipe out people like ISIS is doing. Now, the hammer's neutral. How do you use the tool? That's what determines its worth. No, money's the same way, but it is extremely seductive. It'll suck you in. You know, just think about stories of wealthy people whose kids end up killing themselves. You admire this guy because of all these things he did in his company, but when you hear about his private life, he was always with his company. He was never with his family. The family fell apart. Donald Trump is on, what, his fifth wife? His kids are with him. If the money wasn't, would his kids still be with him? I don't know. I suspect maybe not. What was the value? I don't know their private lives, and I'm not judging them. But that's a usual kind of thing that happens. And I think that these preachers did that. What Billy Graham did, because he was aware of these things, he set up the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. And the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association had a treasurer. And the treasurer paid Billy Graham a salary, and the salary was a modest salary. He did not have exclusive say over how the resources of the ministry was spent, whereas Tammy Faye Baker and Jim Baker did, and the rest of them. He lived in a modest house. He ensured that he was never alone with a member of the opposite sex. When he would meet with people, if he was in his office, his secretary was outside, he was always leaving the office door open, regardless of what subject they were discussing, so that there was never an appearance of impropriety. See, he followed what he preached. It's why Billy Graham could be an advisor to Richard Nixon, to Ronald Reagan, and also to Bill Clinton, JFK, people on both sides of the aisle. Because he was about God first. He wasn't about himself and his own agenda, which leads to things that are, I don't use the word scandalous nowadays. Because he practiced what he preached. I don't know anybody who doesn't admire Billy Graham. His son Franklin has made comments that went off into different areas. When you talk about, he mentioned that at one point that Islam was a dirty religion, caused him a lot of problems with Samaritan's Purse trying to get into Islamic countries after he said that. Billy Graham never said anything like that. Because he believed it was important to be able to go wherever he needed to go, speak to whoever he needed to do, so that he could do what God was asking him to do. So he had to watch what he said. Because he was practicing what he preached. He was living a life for God. And none of us have the same kind of status as the people I mentioned. We're not public figures like that. We're not out there and having people hang on our every word and trying to emulate us and all this kind of stuff. But you know what? I would gather all your friends know you go to church. I would gather that all your friends know that you are Christians, or at least suspect it at a minimum. If that's the case, and you practice what you preach, that person who has never been in church, whose parents never took them to church because they grew up in that period, came of age in the 60s, where a whole lot of people said church is not relevant and left it, and then they had kids, and those kids are now having kids. They know nothing about church. You know what they know about church? Reverend Lovejoy and the Simpsons. That's what they know about church. Literally. Literally. And it's sad. I mean, he comes off as a doofus. Comes off as an absolute moron. Touch with an Angel, maybe a little bit better. Seventh Heaven, maybe a little bit better. But that's all they know about church. And in a lot of things in the media, if someone were to walk in here A lot of these folks think that I would drag them up here, force them down on their knees, and make them commit to Jesus Christ. Right now, so that you don't burn in hell! Now, we laugh at that. But that's what people think. And that's because people have not practiced what they preach. If you practice what you preach, then that person who's never been in a church will say, you know what? If Laura acts that way, she's a Christian, and she says that she's going to live along these ways, she actually lives her life that way. And I kind of like Laura, but you know what? Maybe there is something to this church thing, this God thing after all. Maybe I should go check it out. That is the single most effective method of evangelism that exists. That people see Christ in you. And when you look at Jesus' pronunciations, and what Jesus says to do, and in the letters of Paul and the disciples, what they say is go and live this stuff. You know, practice what you preach. If you say, it is terrible that there's people who are hungry, well, go and feed people, that's a good thing. We should do that. But we should also advocate for policies in government and companies and everything else that work to alleviate the reasons why these people are hungry. If we've got problems with child abuse, well then we should advocate for laws that do that, but also for programs that cause people who are on the edge to kind of go over the line. I mean, an awful lot of times I'm not excusing it, but at the same time, there are reasons why things happen. And if I'm on the edge and I tend to be, my parents beat me, and I'm on the edge and I try really hard, and I get really, really, really stressed out because of all these different situations, things that are happening, am I going to lapse into this bad behavior my parents had? Yeah, that's a very unfortunately foreseeable circumstance. So if you feel that child abuse is wrong, then working towards trying to eliminate some of those things that can contribute is something you should be doing. You know, and this extends into every aspect of our lives. Practicing what you're preaching is not just the public stuff, and it's not just one-on-one. It's much bigger. You know, the United Methodist Church has something called the General Board of Church and Society. If you've ever been to Capitol Hill, and you are standing in front of the Supreme Court building, the Library of Congress is to your right, the Capitol building is behind you, there's a building to your left. You know what building that is? That's the United Methodist building. It was given to the church to fight for temperance. Today, the Board of Church and Society, their job is to lobby Congress, primarily the House, because it's easier to get to see representatives than the only 100 senators, for legislation that is in concert with the social principles of our church. What are the social principles? They're a part of the Book of Discipline that spell out the church's positions on social issues. Things like child labor and abuse and things of that nature. It's readily available. We have some brochures in the back that have some of that in there. You can get it online by going to umc.org, looking at it. That's something that we do as United Methodists on a national scale. But it is practicing what we preach. Timothy puts it very well. He says, or the letter, Paul puts it very well, the letter to Timothy. He says, if your friend is hungry, and you say to him, peace and good life, be well fed, and you don't give him something to eat, what good does it do? Being Christian is not passive, it's active. It's active. Some of us can physically go and do something, some of us can't. You know what we can all do? We can write letters to Congress and say, hey, this piece of legislation is coming up, and this is something that I really care about as a person of faith, and you should vote yes on this. You can all do that, right? Anybody here who can't write a letter? That's what Jesus meant. Now imagine if all of Jesus' followers advocated for an end to hunger and pushed their representatives and their senators and did things and worked in pantries and established hunger agencies and supported others and worked to change the circumstances that resulted in some people having way, way, way more than they need and somebody not having enough to eat and feed their kids on a daily basis, maybe even a weekly basis. Look at Africa. People haven't had anything to eat in a week and they're starving to death and we're throwing food away. There's something really screwed up with this. How do you change it? I don't know. It's a huge system. But it's what we should be looking at. If we are truly followers of Jesus Christ, there's someone who, he said in the Sermon on the Mount, there's somebody who's hungry, give him something. John the Baptist, baptizing people. Teacher, what do you do if you have food? Give something to somebody who doesn't have it. It's not that hard. A lot of people who are not connected with churches or religious communities feel that this is all just a bunch of talk and doesn't make a difference. It's a nice myth. It's something that people need to explain things when they can't understand it on their own or they're not strong enough. If we practice what we preach, we're earnest in doing that, all of a sudden all these high-sounding words and all these platitudes that sound so nice and warm, fuzzy and all that kind of stuff start to become real. And we can change the world for the sake of Jesus Christ. The purpose of the United Methodist Church, stated in our Book of Discipline, is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Practice what you preach. Transform the world. Let's pray.